The miracle doctor won't be a kept man. Chapter 61. The three patriarchs who had been ignoring Kiran all this time finally directed their gazes toward him. Many in the hall turned to look at him too, but mostly with mockery. In their eyes, Kiran was ludicrously ignorant of his standing and asking for his demise. Even the Xanders had to cower before the three big families, so who did he think he was? Scowling, Henry asked, "What problem?" "Xander Corporation's market value is worth billions, and their accounts contain billions as well. You Quinns want to buy a company worth nearly 10 billion for 500 million? Are you trying to commit robbery or are you simply out of your mind?" Kiran pulled no punches. Henry was at a loss for words. If it were not for the sake of looking good in front of the others, he would not even want to spend 500 million. He would just seize the company. Now that Kiran had exposed and humiliated him, he could hardly maintain his composure. "How about I double the amount and buy the Quinn family's property for 1 billion? "Would you sell it?" Kiran asked mockingly. "In your dreams," Henry refused flatly. "You shouldn't do to others what you don't want others to do to you." "You know it's a ridiculous dream, but weren't you daydreaming yourself just now?" "Have you gone senile?" Kiran snickered. Henry trembled with rage. Kiran then looked at Alfred. "You Zeiglers are even more shameless. What did you say?" Alfred felt that Kiran was no different from a rabid dog. "Snow Xander is my wife. How dare you try to take her away without going through me first?" "Maybe you like being Lancelot, but I'm definitely not interested in being King Arthur." Kiran sneered mercilessly. Alfred's body shook with fury. "Humph, your marriage certificate is fake. You think we don't know that?" Theodore hurriedly stepped forward to back him up. "Worked up, aren't you?" Kiran snickered. "You Marshes are much worse. Buying Dragon's Mount for 1 billion? I'm impressed you had the nerve to say that. Even a cemetery there can fetch 10 billion. Are you looking for a burial ground for your family?" First, Theodore almost passed out from all his wrath. Kiran's venomous tongue was just too much to bear. Everyone at the scene was dumbfounded. Was this guy some kind of lunatic? Snow stared at Kiran, recalling how he had faced off the group of bald men in the alley. What a man! There were practically stars in her eyes. However, she immediately suppressed her feelings when she remembered their eventual divorce. Kiran ignored her reaction and looked at the three seething men. "I prepared presents for you three old farts." "Old farts?" Everyone's jaws hit the ground. What presents? Alfred was making every effort to stifle his anger. He would act once Kiran had invoked everyone's hatred. "I cured Fabian Zeigler's impotence. Otherwise, you'll have a wet noodle in your family. I told Zara Marsh to stop getting abortions. If she did it a third time, she'd be infertile for the rest of her life. I also told Evelyn Quinn to tone it down a notch. She's already losing control of her bowel movements." Kiran answered without so much as a pause. Everyone at the scene was thunderstruck. "The reputation of the three big families. Young man, you're really asking for it." The three old men roared in unison. They were utterly mortified. The younger generation of each of their families had just been shamefully exposed for being absolute disappointments, living debauched lives. It was basically removing the fig leaves covering their family's dirtiest secrets. Henry stepped forward and jabbed a finger at Kiran. "You really have a death wish, huh?" Kiran slapped himself lightly on the head as if something had just occurred to him. "Oh, I prepared another present just for you." He fished his phone out of his pocket, an intriguing smile playing on his lips. "I'm sure this will pique your interest." Henry was taken aback to see him bring out his phone. "There's a video inside that I think will be interesting for a lot of people. Much more interesting than your promotional video," Kiran stressed. "Play it," Henry ordered his family. Chapter 62. "Yes, sir." Immediately, one of his family members took the phone inside. Henry and the others followed. Snow tugged on Kiran's sleeve to ask what was happening, but he wrapped a comforting arm around her. She gazed at him. Compared with the rogue he had been at home, he was a completely different person now. "I will definitely last for 2 hours and make that bastard Kiran Han reign over to me." Mitchell Quinn's gleeful voice was heard in the video, and soon, a scandalous scene began to play out. "Turn it off! Turn it off right now!" Henry's eyes were virtually blazing with fury. As if the disgrace brought upon their family by Evelyn was not enough, Mitchell only made it worse. "Don't," Kiran called out. "Don't you want to see what happens in the end?" Henry's mind buzzed with alarm. Sensing something was wrong, he anxiously glanced at his family members. "Play the ending." One of them quickly fast-forwarded the video until the end, which showed Alora shrieking and Mitchell dying after coughing blood and convulsing. At the sight of his grandson's death, Henry shook violently and cried out, "Bad news, Mr. Henry! Mr. Mitchell is dead!" At that moment, an elderly man in gray shouted from the entrance, "Yeesh." All heads swiveled to the man who had just appeared. His face was pale, his right arm severed, and his body covered in dried blood. "Grayson, what on earth happened?" Holding on to his family members for support, Henry clutched his chest and asked Grayson. Grayson had passed out after having his arms severed by a single punch from Kiran. He had awakened to the sight of Mitchell's stiff corpse and rushed here to deliver the news. Trying his best to calm his breathing, he gulped. "Mr. Mitchell, he kidnapped a girl but ended up dying of excessive sex," Kiran spoke for him. Henry's body quivered uncontrollably, his eyes burning with grief and rage. In the end, he shifted his piercing gaze to Kiran. "You did that? This is a society governed by law. How could I possibly commit murder?" Kiran smiled but continued, "On the contrary, I helped prevent Mr. Mitchell from committing rape. You should thank me." "He was the one who barged into number 3, Dragonview Residences." Grayson glared at Kiran. "I barged in?" Kiran retorted coldly. He approached Grayson and fixed him with a stare. "Why don't you explain to everyone why I did that?" Grayson hesitated. He could not reveal that Mitchell had kidnapped Rainfrost. "I don't care what reason you had. You will die." Knowing his own grandson had done something awful, Henry bellowed. "So, the Quinn family gets to decide what's right or wrong. Is this your way of doing things?" Kiran demanded furiously. "Yes." Henry was bent on killing Kiran. Kiran turned to Alfred and Theodore. "Is it the same for both of you two?" Their responding silence was an indication of their agreement. Kiran glanced at the dinner guests, many of whom were sniggering and wearing scornful expressions. To them, Kiran was a suicidal fool for coming here and flaunting how he had caused Mitchell's death instead of fleeing at the first opportunity. Snow's eyes flashed with panic as she glanced at Kiran. Had he discovered his identity as a York? Without realizing it, she tightened her hold on Kiran protectively. Kiran was slightly moved. Thud, thud, thud. Footsteps sounded in the banquet hall as dozens of bodyguards swarmed in. These were people handsomely paid by the 3 big families for their services. Each had blood on their hands and could easily hold their own against several opponents. The atmosphere in the hall instantly grew suffocating. Kiran was like a lone wolf surrounded by an enemy pack. It was a scene similar to Neptune's Cove karaoke the previous day. "Young man, since you've chosen to dig your own grave, today will be the day you die." Henry straightened his back proudly. Where he was and who was watching no longer mattered. All he could think about was avenging his grandson. Sweeping his gaze coolly over the bodyguard, Kiran ignored them and fixed an unreadable stare on the 3 patriarchs. "As if you weaklings can overwhelm me with your numbers." Chapter 63. As if weaklings can overwhelm me with their numbers? The guests gawked at Kiran, hardly able to believe their ears. Wasn't that boast a little over the top? Those were highly paid bodyguards. "Kill him!" Unable to stand the insult, someone among the bodyguards roared. "Clomp, clomp!" All the bodyguards surged forward, glaring at Kiran viciously, eager to beat him to a pulp. "Stop causing trouble," Snow anxiously persuaded Kiran. "What if I can defeat them all?" Kiran asked, chuckling. "That's not possible." Snow shook her head incredulously. "What if it is? Then what do you want?" Snow was bewildered. "A divorce?" "Go to hell!" Snow pinched him under his armpit. What a jerk he was to be thinking about divorce while holding a beautiful woman like her in his arms. Ouch. Kiran let out a dramatic yelp. It was so unexpected that it stunned everyone. However, they became exasperated the next second. How could Kiran be in the mood to flirt right now? This was an outright provocation. Damn you. His disdain drove the bodyguards mad with rage. Eewoo. Raising their fists, they charged at Kiran. Useless pigs. Cursing loudly, Kiran lifted his hand and shot flashes of light toward them. Thump! Whump! The bodyguards fell to the ground unconscious, a silver needle lodged in each of their bodies. The onlookers were utterly staggered. Snow covered her mouth as if she had seen a monster. Was this guy even human? Alfred, Theodore, and Henry were just as appalled. They had expected a bloody battle to unfold. But Kiran had managed to defeat all the bodyguards without spilling a drop of blood. Gulp! Grayson's throat bobbed audibly, fear in his eyes. Kiran York was a man of mystery and a formidable fighter. Glancing at his severed arm, Grayson knew he had survived a brush with death. Kiran released his grip on Snow and looked at the guests. "At Neptune's Cove karaoke yesterday, I said, you'll have to go through me if you want to attack the Xander family, didn't I? If there's anyone. Who doesn't remember that? Come forward. I'll help you refresh your memory." Snow's body quivered, and warmth filled her heart. This jerk was always going on and on about getting a divorce, but could he be in love with her after all? Why else would he stand up for the Xander family like this? What an annoying guy saying he wanted to divorce her when he was actually in love with her. Oh, she was definitely going to rub this in his face once they got home. Go through you? Ha-ha, Alfred chortled. Even the York family didn't have the guts to say something like that 20 years ago. Who do you think you are? Theodore straightened his short body. Bayville belongs to us, the three big families. Youngster, you will pay with your life for what happened to my grandson, Henry declared harshly. The three big families declared war on Kiran at the same time. Kiran sneered at them. The York family may not have had the guts to say that 20 years ago, but today, 20 years later, one of them just did. Are you all deaf? One of them just did. Are you all deaf? The question rang out loud and clear. A death-like silence descended over the room. Alfred, Theodore, and Henry were shell-shocked. Kiran was a York. Kiran had just boldly admitted that he was a member of the York family. Were there still living descendants of the York family? What are you blabbering about, Kiran? You're not related to the York family, Snow scolded anxiously, her face drained of color. She was aware of Kiran's identity and the animosity between both parties. Her reaction further convinced everyone that Kiran was indeed a York family member. Fixing his blazing eyes on the crowd, Kiran raised his right hand and pointed his thumb at his chest. I am Kiran York, heir to the York family, once the greatest family in Bayville. I am still alive. The York family's bloodline has not yet ended. The York family is back. The York family is back. The room was in an uproar. Crackle! A loud clap of thunder sounded, followed by flashes of lightning streaking through the sky. It was as if the wandering ghosts of the York family were venting all their sorrow and hatred. Chapter 64. Many older guests recalled the massacre that had taken place in Bayville 20 years ago. Over 100 members of the greatest family in Bayville had died overnight without leaving anyone behind to bury the bodies. Their deaths occurred in peculiar ways and were shrouded in mystery, but no one dared to uncover it. That was because of the three big families. Even a fool would know that. That was precisely why they were willing to work together and even curry favor with the three big families despite knowing they were vicious wolves. Now, the York family was back. However, would they still be able to reign supreme after being gone for 20 years? No matter the answer, Kiran York, this man before them, was certainly a man of indomitable spirit. Who would have the courage to admit they were from the York family? Only Kiran York and Kiran York alone. What a dauntless man. Are you really one of the dregs of the York family? Although Alfred had somehow anticipated this, he was still taken aback by the revelation. Dregs? Ha-ha. Kiran cackled, bloodthirstiness brewing in his eyes. 20 years later, the dregs of the three big families will cease to exist in Bayville. You talk too big for your own good, young man. Realizing that Kiran intended to massacre the three big families, Theodore boomed. Wordlessly, Kiran placed his hands behind his back and strode toward the elderly trio. Every step he took was calm, composed, and poised. It was as if the three big families, the figures of highest worship in Bayville, were nothing to him, and he could easily control their lives. The members of the three big families were indignant. 20 years ago, they had wiped out almost the entire York family without letting anyone escape. How could they allow a York family member to treat them as if they were invisible now, 20 years later? They, the three big families, were the ones in control of Bayville. Kill him. Henry was livid. Enduring the pain, Grayson stomped his feet, crushing the marble tiles with a loud crack and producing a web-like pattern in the rubble. Like a bolt of lightning, he shot toward Kiran, determined to be the first to kill him to avenge the insult inflicted on himself. However, his ankle was suddenly grasped by what felt like iron pliers. His eyes widened in alarm when he realized it was Kiran's left hand gripping him. He tried to break free, but Kiran abruptly swung him around and hurled him toward the northeast corner of the hall like a ball. Die, you piece of trash! Grayson's body hurtled through the air like a ball. The crack of his bones sounded as he hit the wall, then sank to the floor in a lifeless heap. Hiss! That was the sound of the crowd's sharp, collective intake of breath. The onlookers had already been dumbfounded when he had subdued the bodyguards with a handful of silver needles. It was even more horrifying to see him smash Grayson to a pulp with a flick of his hand. Grayson was many times stronger than those bodyguards. Kiran York's abilities were unfathomable. The atmosphere in the room grew suffocating. Ha 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 ha. Sardonic laughter suddenly erupted from Alfred. This managed to lift much of the heaviness in the hall. Grayson's death and Alfred's laughter threw the room into a state of confusion. Theodore and Henry stood calmly in place, not afraid of Kiran. A hush instantly fell over the agitated guests. The shock they had gotten from Kiran's actions slowly disappeared. No matter how powerful he was but one man. How could he contend with the three big families? He was no match for them at all. He would ultimately fail. One by one, their minions piped up. Snowzander, it seems you want your family to meet their demise like the Yorks. Making an enemy of the three big families is asking for death. Hand over your family's property and yourself to the three big families, and you can escape disaster. The three patriarchs regarded Kiran calmly as if the death that had just occurred no longer mattered to them. Who dares to lay a hand on my wife? However, Kiran let out a roar and leaped into the air. Chapter 65. Kiran's sudden movement surprised everyone. Kiran streaked past their heads to where Grayson had collapsed. What was he trying to do? Was he going to abuse his corpse further? While they were still perplexed, the curtains in a quiet corner flapped wildly as if stirred by a hurricane. The next moment they lashed out at Kiran like huge boulders rolling down from the top of the mountain. Without flinching, Kiran raised his hand again and sent another burst of white light zipping past. Thump! That was the sound of something hitting the ground. Only then did everyone see that an old man dressed like Grayson had collapsed on his back, with a silver needle barely visible to the naked eye stuck between his eyebrows. Hiss! Alfred, Theodore, and Henry gasped, a trace of nervousness peeking through their calm expressions. They had not expected this. Kiran stepped forward, grabbed the man by the front of his shirt, and flung him at the crowd. Eeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeee in gray slammed into the floor like a ball of flesh. His body convulsed and buckled, and he spurted out 2 mouthfuls of blood. But he was not dead. He stared ahead with wide eyes, unable to utter a single word. Kiran's eyes slid calmly to the other 3 corners of the banquet hall. "Are you going to come out yourselves, or do you want me to make you?" The guests looked around in bewilderment. Were there more of them? Not too shabby for a fledgling. A voice spoke, and 3 old men in gray clothes emerged simultaneously. Their landing was silent, but the marble floor under their feet splintered into web-like smithereens. The tables around them moved despite the absence of wind, and the silverware clattered against each other. They exuded an invisible yet overbearing aura. The guests were stunned. They had not expected that so many strong fighters would be hiding in this banquet hall. They were even more awed by the power of the 3 big families. "Not too shabby," Kiran scoffed, gesturing at the fallen man on the floor. "You call this not too shabby? Let's all take him out together," one of the men shouted and leaped into the air without wasting another second and lunged at Kiran. Meanwhile, the man who had spoken first suddenly charged in Snow's direction. Everyone was stunned by the abrupt change. Kiran's expression was glacial. "Trying to lay a hand on my wife? Die!" Woo! Like an arrow, he sprang toward Snow. The two men attacking Kiran moved to stop him so they could buy their companion more time. From Kiran's reaction, it was clear to them that Snow's safety was of great importance to him. As long as Snow was in their control, Kiran would be but a shackled beast. They would have nothing to fear. Just then, both felt their bodies stiffen as well as difficulty breathing. They glanced down, only to find their necks in Kiran's left and right grip. Kiran snapped their necks with a sickly crack before they could withdraw their outstretched arms to fight back. Thud! Whump! Those were the sounds of their dead bodies falling to the ground. The old man charging Snow paused in his tracks, but he recovered a split second later and made a grab for her neck. Snow was rooted to the spot with fear. Before the assailant could touch her, she felt her body fly into the air. Kiran's figure appeared before her, his left hand seizing the man's outstretched right wrist and his right hand directly squeezing his throat. "Anyone who lays a hand on my wife shall die." Crack! The clear sound of bones snapping rang out once again. With his neck no longer able to provide support, the gray-clad man's head drooped limply to the right. Kiran loosened his grip, and the body slumped lifelessly to the floor. "Who dares to lay a hand on my wife?" Kiran boomed, turning to the crowd. His voice echoed in the banquet hall and the ears of the listeners, whose hearts were pounding as if a storm raged in their chests. None of them had believed in his abilities a while ago when he uttered that question. However, no one dared to doubt him anymore. His presence was overwhelming. Was this what a king looked like? Snow gazed at Kiran, her almond-shaped eyes shimmering and her heart swelling with sweet happiness. Chapter 66. She never knew this jerk loved her this much. He was making her blush. She was starting to doubt if Kiran's insistence on a divorce had only been a deliberate attempt to rile her. She was determined not to let the divorce happen. Kiran turned his gaze to the three patriarchs. "Try laughing now, old farts," he spoke in a commanding voice dripping with sarcasm. However, none of them could bring themselves to laugh. They had lost their insurance. All four men in gray were formidable fighters revered by their families and offered them protection from the shadows. Over the years, these men had dealt with all the difficult problems for their families. Today was their 20th anniversary celebration, so they instructed the four to hide in the dark to help maintain order and prevent unwanted incidents. That was why they had remained fearless when Kiran subdued the bodyguards and killed Grayson. Who would have thought their faith in their protectors would be all for naught? "Kiran York, killing is a crime." Alfred seized the opportunity to accuse him. "They were the ones trying to kill me just now. I was just defending myself," Kiran replied coolly. Theodore stepped forward and declared emphatically, "No matter what reason, you killed them. You're a criminal and what?" Kiran's figure materialized in front of him like a ghost. All color drained from Theodore's face as he staggered backward. "And shut your trap." Kiran's hand shot up and slapped Theodore on each cheek. The strikes were so loud and hard that everyone was dumbfounded. Did he just slap one of the heads of the three big families? What was more, he did it while roasting him. What a badass. No one called you criminals when all those York family members died. You want to lecture me about crime? Are you retarded, or do you take me for a fool? Kiran demanded hotly. "Sprart!" Theodore spat out a mouthful of blood, unable to say a word. Kiran directed his gaze at Alfred and Henry. Both stumbled backward, shocked at his aggressiveness and viciousness. "Scared, old farts?" Kiran sneered at them. "Oomph! Not at all!" Henry tried to sound furious. "Not at all, huh?" Kiran raised his hand to strike Henry. "Ah!" Henry screamed and shielded his head in terror. "Ha ha! You're already scared even though I haven't hit you," Kiran chortled. "You." Henry realized Kiran had just made a fool out of him, but he was at a loss for words. How could he remain unafraid of such a formidable man, especially when he had witnessed him dispatch the three gray-clad men like a callous butcher? "What do you want, Kiran York?" Alfred, who was relatively calmer, asked. "You want to know the answer?" Kiran replied icily. "Yes." Alfred's tone was equally frosty. "Then kneel and obey me." Kiran pointed to the floor beneath his feet. "Don't push your luck, Kiran York," Henry roared. They had already been seriously humiliated by Kiran. If they were to kneel before him, The reputation of their families would go down the drain. Smack! Kiran slapped him. "You have no right to bargain with me, old fool. Sprart." Henry spat out a mouthful of blood, and all his dental inlays fell out as well. "Are you going to kneel or not?" Kiran thundered, glaring at Alfred. Alfred maintained a tough front, though he was already shaking inside. "You... Mac..." Kiran's palm collided with his cheek. "I am the current head of the York family." It was a bellow filled with burning rage and authority. A declaration that he was king. "I'll do it." Blinking his small eyes, Theodore was the first to cry out and drop to his knees. He was smart enough to understand that no one could challenge Kiran. Any sort of resistance would only be quelled more harshly. Slowly, Henry and Alfred lowered themselves onto their knees as if they were enduring excruciating pain. A memory of a similar scene surfaced in their minds. "If I kneel before you, will you spare my whole family?" Titus York, head of the greatest family in Bayville, pleaded for their mercy. They had mocked and ridiculed Titus's kneeling and gave free rein to their arrogance and ecstasy. Now they were suffering the same fate. Chapter 67. The hall went utterly still. It was so quiet that no one dared to breathe loudly, so quiet that even a pin drop could be heard. Kiran stood tall and proud. All eyes in the room were on him. He was young, arrogant, and domineering. His last name was York. For 20 years, the York family had been a taboo subject, a joke, and an object of ridicule for those trying to curry favor with the three big families. For 20 years, the dead family members, including the bodies of Titus York and his wife, were nowhere to be found. For 20 years, the York family was known as a family that had crumbled into extinction. Even the Xander family was about to perish soon. For 20 years, the three big families built their development story in Bayville on the my way or the highway principle. Who would have imagined Kiran York, heir to the York family, would return 20 years later? Who would have imagined Kiran York declaring war and revenge at a celebration that marked the three big families' eminence 20 years later? His aura was unmatchable. How could anyone not fear his power? The heads of the three big families, who had basked in the public's veneration and flattery for 20 years, were kneeling before Kiran, a youngster in his early 20s. They were kneeling not to him but to the York family. Everyone was screaming and struggling inside as if a violent storm had ravaged their hearts. The York family, the supreme ruler, was back. Bayville was about to witness a regime change. The glorious and benevolent York family was about to return. Kiran looked around the banquet hall as if he were looking at the deceased York family members who had not been laid to rest. The rain outside the window seemed to lament the grievances and humiliation the York family had endured for 20 years. Human hearts were cruel, just like wind and rain. Only the strong could control destiny. He would become strong and control the destiny of the York family. He would become the supreme ruler and restore the York family's former glory. He withdrew his gaze and fixed it on the three elderly men before him. Volcanic anger swirled in the depths of his eyes, but he suppressed it. In 3 months, a funeral for the York family's deceased will be held on Dragon's Mount. Members of the three big families shall dress in mourning attire, place the coffins into the graves, and then carry out their own execution. Right after Kiran made his demand, the hall fell into eerie silence again. All hearts seemed to be on the verge of shattering. It was too tall of an order. It was impossible. Or else. Kiran spoke again, drawing everyone's attention. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, he slowly turned around, raised his foot, and brought it down. The sharp crack of bones breaking rang out. The chest of the man who had fallen before the other three collapsed, leaving behind a foot-shaped indentation. Blood splattered all over Kiran's body, as well as the three patriarchs' faces. If Kiran did not move, they did not dare either. "You can expect blood for blood!" Kiran hurled those words at them viciously. Scooping a shell-shocked Snow into his arms, he strode for the entrance. His youthful body was not large. However, the savagery radiating off him filled the hall with a suffocating atmosphere. The York family. "Kiran York, blood for blood!" His words continued to echo unnervingly. Plonk! Feeling the energy drain from their bodies, the three kneeling men sank heavily to the floor. Theodore's shouts came first. "Absolutely not! We'll make you suffer a fate worse than death. The York family's bloodline will end." Henry roared. "Kiran York, you will die," Alfred thundered. Despite hearing them, Kiran did not look back. An apathetic smile formed on his lips. For the next 3 months, he would welcome anyone from the 3 big families suicidal enough to challenge him. He would be more than happy to let them experience the thrill of seeing their own kin die. This was just the beginning of the York family's revenge, a foretaste of the agony that was to come for the 3 big families. Over the next 3 months, Kiran would make them wish they had never been born. Chapter 68. They would agonize as much as they had triumphed. They would go through the same kind of torment the York family had to bear. A living hell, that was the retribution Kiran had decided for them. Kiran went downstairs and zoomed off in the limited edition Ferrari given by Fabian Ziegler. When the car stopped in front of their house, Snow was still too stupefied to get out herself. It was Kiran who had carried her into the car and fastened her seatbelt for her just now. In the end, he had no choice but to carry her upstairs into their room. Snow's arms were still wrapped around Kiran's neck as they entered the room. "You want to take a bath with me or what?" Kiran's teasing voice sounded in Snow's ears. Huh? Only then did Snow snap out of her daze. Instead of letting go of Kiran, she held him tighter and burst into tears. Kiran's heart softened. This woman was kind and simple. She truly cared about him and had really been scared for him. However, he was still traumatized by the image of the ugly woman, so he raised his hand and patted Snow on the back. "Hey, your seduction tactics aren't going to work, you know. Even if I sleep with you, I'm still getting that divorce." His words immediately yanked Snow out of her stupor, and her face clouded with fury. She opened her mouth and bit down hard on Kiran's shoulder. Ah! Kiran howled in pain and released his hold on Snow, letting her fall to the floor. Caught off guard by his sudden release, Snow lost her balance and thudded to the floor with enough impact to split her rear into several pieces. Bursting with rage, she glared at him. "You hateful jerk! Even if you're the last man alive on Earth, I'll never sleep with you." Kiran rubbed his throbbing shoulder in exasperation. "Ha! You're the last person I'd sleep with. I'm getting that divorce for sure. Dream on." "I'll never divorce you. You won't get to be with another woman for the rest of your life." Snow refused to be outdone. "You can suck it when I get a sugar baby first thing tomorrow." Kiran stomped off to the bathroom. "If you can find one, I'll confess my love for you." Snow did not believe him at all. Kiran stopped in front of the bathroom door and turned to look at Snow with a grin. "Wanna bet?" Snow smirked. "Of course, but what if you fail?" "If I fail, I'll forget about the divorce and spend the rest of my life with you." "Police! As if I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Even if we don't get a divorce, I'll let you live like a monk forever." The corners of Kiran's mouth lifted when he remembered Rainfrost. "You can start getting ready to confess your love to me tomorrow." Whistling, he swaggered into the bathroom. Snow scowled after him. She stamped her foot and waved her fist, grumbling to herself, "Meanie, does he have to act this way over a photoshopped picture?" When she recalled how he had shouted, "Who dares to lay a hand on my wife?" she felt like her heart was about to burst with joy and affection. The more she thought about Kiran's assertiveness and manliness, the more she was fascinated by him. In fact, she had probably fallen in love with him. Otherwise, how could she agree to that bet? However, she was absolutely certain Kiran would not be able to find himself a sugar baby. Why would any woman fall for him? Only an unlucky girl threatened by her own grandpa would. Little did Snow know that Rainfrost's existence would put her in an awkward spot in their bet. Kiran stood under the shower with tears streaming down his face. A man wept only when deeply grieved. If he had found out about the York family's past earlier, he would not have waited until today for revenge. He vowed to himself that he would make the 3 big families suffer miserable fates for the next 3 months as vengeance for the York family. Meanwhile, Alfred, Henry, and Theodore sat together, their faces stony and their eyes flaring with rage. Chapter 69. "That damned York bastard!" Henry raged when he remembered how his grandson Mitchell had died and how he had knelt to Kiran. Theodore's beady eyes darted around. His unreadable expression was also shrouded in bloodthirstiness. Alfred, however, was surprisingly calm. "I think we should report this matter immediately. We're obviously no match for Kiran York right now." His words pacified Henry and Theodore. He was right. If they could fight Kiran York, they would not have knelt to him. They had thoroughly humiliated themselves by kneeling in front of the most prominent people in Bayville. But what other choice did they have? The guardians they had depended on had been reduced to weak kittens before Kiran. Monster! Theodore swore under his breath. Alfred dialed a number on his phone. After a few rings, the call was answered. He motioned for Henry and Theodore to be quiet, then said carefully, "A member of the York family is still alive. His name is Kiran York. He's returned to Bayville, and—" "Got it." The person on the other end cut him off and, after a moment of silence, said, "Stick it out for another 7 days while I make the necessary arrangements." Click! The line went dead. Alfred gripped the phone, his hand trembling with excitement. With that reassurance, Kiran York was a dead man. Ha-ha! Alfred could not help himself from laughing out loud. "Are they going to take action?" Henry asked anxiously. "They told us to stick it out for 7 days, and then they'll deal with him." A triumphant smile returned to Alfred's face. "Great. In that case, we'll allow Kiran York to live for another 7 days. Henry sounded as if they were sparing Kiran mercy. Theodore's small eyes were blinking and shining with anticipation as well. "Inform all members of our families to stay away from Kiran York and avoid provoking him for the time being," Alfred reminded. Henry and Theodore nodded. After some more conspiring, they left. The next day. After waking up and getting dressed, Kiran searched the house for food, but found none, much to his frustration. Didn't Snow need to eat? Stopping before Snow's bedroom door, he raised his hand and banged on it 3 times with enough force to shake it. Snow was changing her underwear in the room. Infuriated by the noise, she threw open the door. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Kiran could not help gaping, but he quickly turned away. "Why are you always trying to seduce me?" "First." Snow blushed furiously. In a fit of anger, she had forgotten that she was still changing. She shut the door with a bang and yelled, "Screw you, I'll never let you touch me." Kiran wordlessly touched a finger to his nose as he thought to himself, "Was the person I kissed and touched not Snowzander? If not, could it have been— Ghost?" Kiran shouted suddenly, sending a chill down Snow's spine, and she opened the door with a pale face. What ghost? An ugly female ghost. Kiran backed away, grinning broadly. "I'm going to kill you!" Maddened that he had duped her, Snow lunged at him, ignoring the fact that she was partially naked. "The ugly female ghost is going to molest me." Kiran ran out of the room yelling. Snow flew into the air and stood in the hall. She was so angry that she went crazy and stamped her foot. "You asshole! I'll make you kneel at my feet one day. Mark my words." With their bet in mind, he sauntered down the stairs in high spirits. As soon as he arrived downstairs, he saw a group of people gathered in a circle, and there seemed to be a person lying on the ground. "Isn't that Mr. George? Why is he unconscious?" "No idea. Is he having a stroke again?" "Call his son, quick." "I already did. I've called the ambulance, too." Kiran hurried over to them. "Excuse me, let me take a look." "He's having a stroke." After giving his conclusion, he swiftly inserted a silver needle into the old man's head, followed by several more. Chapter 70. "Are you a doctor?" someone asked curiously. Kiran said nothing and concentrated on his work. "Young man, I'd advise you to stay put if you're unsure what you're doing. George's son Adrian is the director of Bayville Hospital's cardiology department. If anything happens, you'll have to bear the consequences." Someone offered a friendly reminder. George groaned from his spot on the floor and slowly opened his eyes. "He's awake," the crowd of onlookers exclaimed with joy. Just then, the wailing of an ambulance siren was heard. The vehicle skidded to a stop, and out jumped a middle-aged male doctor in a white coat. "Dad, Dr. Lane's here." The crowd parted to make way for him. "Adrian, you're here." George sat up when he saw Adrian. "I thought you had a stroke. How come?" Adrian had rushed over in an ambulance after receiving the call in the hospital, so he was surprised to see his dad conscious. This young man revived him with acupuncture. Someone in the crowd pointed at Kiran. Adrian's eyes landed on Kiran. "It's you! You're that miracle doctor!" With a face full of joy, he stepped forward to grasp Kiran's hand and said enthusiastically, "I searched everywhere for you after we parted ways on the train, but I never thought you'd be the one saving my father today. I can't thank you enough." When the residents heard Adrian call Kiran a miracle doctor and speak to him with such reverence, they also started looking at him with respect. Kiran said calmly. No problem. You don't have to worry about your dad's stroke anymore. As long as he takes proper care of his health, he'll be able to recover completely. Thank you, thank you. After thanking him profusely, Adrian turned to his father. Dad, you can move into my place today and sell this house. I can't let you live alone anymore. George tried to decline. The onlookers tried to persuade him. Your son really cares for you. You should listen to him. In the end, George nodded. Adrian produced a card and offered it to Kiran with both hands. Here's my business card. Please call me when you have the time. Sure! Kiran took it and pocketed it nonchalantly. Adrian left with his father, and the crowd dispersed. Just like that, the episode ended. 20 minutes later, Snow came downstairs. Seeing Kiran sitting in his limited edition Ferrari, she remembered how he had wrecked hers, which she had lovingly bought with the money given by her parents. Her temper flared, and ignoring him, Snow whirled around and stalked to the gates. She was not riding with him. Smirking, Kiran started the car and quickly caught up to Snow. This 50 million car's really something. By the way, I'm going to take a tour around Bayville University today to see if I can bring a sugar baby back with me. Like fuel, his announcement stoked Snow's anger and caused it to boil over. She immediately stopped in her tracks, opened the car door, and got into the car. Kiran whistled as he watched her climb in. If you love me, just say so, Snow snorted. I don't love you. Liar, Kiran pretended to scoff. I love your money. All of a sudden, Snow's attitude changed dramatically, and she beamed at Kiran. Kiran rolled his eyes. What a liar this woman is. Pleased with herself, Snow began to contemplate all sorts of ways to make Kiran's life difficult. Of course, she had decided to come with him mainly because she was worried about him going out alone. After all, now that his identity had been revealed, the three big families would definitely seek revenge. Kiran drove to Xander Corporation. He planned to go to Margaret's place at Iron West Park after dropping Snow off.